In under 3 days, Egypt has seen a major shift in political events. The military gave President Mohamed Morsi a 48-hour ultimatum to heed to the will of the people, calling for his resignation. And Morsi remained defiant. The army took over, ousting President Morsi. Morsi, who is Egypt's first freely elected leader, is under house arrest after what he says was a military coup. There were celebrations in major cities in Egypt Wednesday night following the army's takeover. Early Thursday, an interim leader was appointed and reports of members of the Muslim Brotherhood arrested. The upheaval comes after days of mass rallies against Morsi and the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood movement. These are live pictures that we are bringing you from Tahrir Square. As you can see, masses of people pouring in. Most of these reports say celebrating the ouster of Mohamed Morsi. The top judge of Egypt's Constitutional Court, Adli Mahmoud Mansour, has been sworn in as interim leader. He was appointed by consensus of all political parties who joined the army in the dialogue that planned Egypt's transitional period. CCTV's Adel Mahroui reports.
Among tight security measures from Egypt's armed forces, the country marked the inauguration of its interim president, Adli Mansour. He came by consensus of all political parties which joined the army in the dialogue that planned Egypt's transitional period.
I receive with extreme pride and appreciation the order of my appointment to become president through the next transitional period, from those who have the power to issue it to the great people of Egypt after June the 30th that came to correct the path of our glorious revolution.
Mr. Mansour's appointment came after hundreds of thousands of Egyptians took the streets demanding Morsi to step down. While protesters remained in the streets, the army announced on Wednesday Morsi's ouster.
Salutations to the armed forces. That was and always has been the foundation of our country, its fortress and security. It never hesitated for one moment to respond to the calls of the nation and respond to the people's demands.
But as Tahrir celebrated, Morsi's supporters showed their objection during a sieged sit-in. The army isolated the former president and detained leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party for various accusations.
It is a huge responsibility. I hope that Egypt will finally reach stability with his efforts through the transitional period until he paves way for presidential elections. I am sure he will do this with the help of the armed forces.
Mansour was the chief of the High Constitutional Court, Egypt's Supreme Court. The 67-year-old president will monitor the year-long transition through which Egyptians must agree on a constitution and proceed with parliament and presidential elections. No one could have imagined that after just 1 year we would return to the same place, the Constitutional Court, for the inauguration of a new Egyptian president. He comes with high hopes for unity and prosperity for all Egyptians. Adel Mahroui, CCTV, Cairo.
Another political transition in Egypt. Let's get more details from CCTV's Yasser Hakim. He's live in Cairo. Yasser, interim President Adli Mansour has called on the Muslim Brotherhood to be part of the political transition. What do the people in Egypt feel about this?
Well, there's a bit of skepticism, not because of the mistakes done by the Muslim Brotherhood in its year in power, which led to the demonstrations that ousted the president, the former president Morsi, but because of what happened afterwards, and that is the attacks by the Muslim Brotherhood followers on various police stations, on Egyptians in several cities, killing around 12 so far and injuring 500. And this has given even more fear of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that it might again return to the old years of 1980s when there was a military organization wreaking havoc in the country with bombings and so forth. So the Egyptians are yet to decide if they will grasp or merge the Muslim Brotherhood back into the political sphere, but we also have to remember they have millions of followers who voted for them in several elections in the last 2 years, so they should not be disregarded in the future as Egypt builds its new institutions and political framework.
Yes, sir. There are reports that arrest warrants have been issued for some members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Can you confirm this?
Yes, already the deputy chief of the Muslim Brotherhood and the president of the Freedom and Justice Party, that's the political arm of the Brotherhood, and as well as one of the financiers and tycoons of the Brotherhood have been arrested already. And the others are now wanted by police, and there's a search warrant for them. It is true and confirmed, and the police, the Minister of Interior has confirmed these reports, and he says that they are wanted for inciting violence amongst Egyptians, especially in their speeches in the last couple of days, calling for their followers to defend the Muslim Brotherhood with their lives, and this is considered inciting violence in the community.
So, yes, sir, what's next now for Egypt's political process?
Now the new president has announced that on Saturday he will announce the constitutional decree. Now this constitutional decree on Saturday, he will dismiss the constitution, the current constitution. It will be suspended. The Shura Council, Parliament will be suspended, and he will announce a roadmap for Egypt when and how the new parliamentary elections will be put forth, how the new constitution will be created and established. There should be a committee that will establish and put forth the new constitution. And right now, as we speak, he is trying to form a government, a coalition government. One of the candidates, the main candidates for this government is Mohammed al-Baradei, the Nobel laureate, to be the prime minister. So he is in consultations now to form a government and to choose a new prime minister to oversee the transitional period, and obviously the elections in the parliament and the presidential elections in the next few months.
All right, yes, sir, thanks very much for updating us. Yes, sir, Hakim, live in Cairo. Now, following the latest events in Egypt, the African Union has said it will provide support for the country to gain control of the situation and have a peaceful transition. CCTV's Groom Chala has more.
Following the latest popular uprising of Egypt and the ousting of President Mohamed Morsi from power by the country's military, the African Union expressed its readiness to help the country stabilize itself peacefully. The chairperson of the African Union Commission, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, is closely monitoring the developments in Egypt, said the statement of the African Union. She is particularly concerned about the tension prevailing in the country and the risks that this situation poses to stability and security in Egypt, as well as to the consolidation of its democratic process. The press statement of the African Union Commission revealed the chairperson of the Commission recalling the AU principled position on unconstitutional change of government underlines the need for all Egyptian stakeholders to work towards a solution of the current crisis through dialogue in order to find an appropriate response to the popular aspirations within the framework of legality and Egyptian institutions. The Continental Organization also wants Egyptians to preserve the achievements of the revolution of 2011. The chairperson, Dlamini-Zuma, further promised to dispatch to Egypt as soon as possible a group of eminent African personalities to consult with the Egyptian stakeholders and assist in the initiation of a responsible and constructive dialogue that would help Egyptian people overcome the difficult situation they are facing. Grumtala, CCTV at the African Union headquarters, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Meanwhile, China's foreign ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying has made comments on the unrest in Egypt. She says China has called on all parties there to refrain from violence and try to resolve their issues through peaceful negotiations.
China is closely following the latest developments in Egypt. China calls on all parties in Egypt to refrain from violence and to try to resolve disagreements through peaceful negotiations. China respects the will and choice of the Egyptian people. The Chinese and Egyptian peoples have a long history of friendship, and cooperative relations will not be affected by events in the country.
The U.S. government has been caught off guard by the ousting of Egypt's first democratically elected president by a coup. That's according to human rights groups who say this is the moment for the administration to start getting its Egypt policy right. The White House has come under fresh fire for having got too close to the now former Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi at the expense of democratic reforms. The deepening political crisis in Egypt has unleashed a growing sense of alarm in Washington. CCTV's Nina Mari reports.
Well, the ousting of Egypt's first democratically elected president presents a real test for the Obama administration, which to some extent has been outpaced by events on the ground. The White House now says it is studying what this coup might mean, whether in fact it's a genuine coup. This amid mounting calls for the U.S. administration to cut its military and economic aid to Egypt. Analysts say that despite what members of Congress might want, it's actually not something that the Obama administration necessarily wants to do, because up until now it has refused to cut economic and military aid to Egypt.
It's premature to suggest that we have taken steps, we're thinking about taking steps. I'm not going to get ahead of course, events on the ground, but clearly assessments would be made based on the facts on the ground and choices made by all parties.
Well, the dilemma in Washington has been divisions between those who have supported former President Morsi in the hope of long-term democratic reforms and those who have been calling for his removal for months. And that really reflects the dilemma that Washington faces, how to find a middle path in positioning itself in Egyptian politics. Charles Dunn of Freedom House is one of 43 NGO employees who was convicted by an Egyptian court as part of a crackdown last month. And he says that the administration's mistake has been to align itself and get too close to the former Egyptian president.
You see, for example, the NGO case playing out. The administration was very active in the early days when there were 8 Americans who were being essentially prevented from leaving Egypt. Once those Americans were out, the level of political attention to that case went way down. That's very frustrating. When there was the constitutional declaration by President Morsi last December, in which he essentially seized all executive and judicial powers for himself, the administration's reaction was very muted. And that sends, I think, a very incorrect message. So yes, I mean, there's a lot of frustration, not only for myself, but other people who follow Egypt closely, that the U.S. has been missing opportunities to really help advance the democratic transition.
Well, with the situation in Egypt so clearly in flux, some experts are saying there's very little that the White House can actually do except to wait and see how things pan out in Egypt. Other analysts are saying it's time for the Obama administration to take this opportunity to stand back and to start standing up for democratic principles and not choose favorites in what undoubtedly is about to become a very complicated political landscape in Egypt. Nina Marepot, CCTV in Washington.
All right, let's get more global reactions to the developments in Egypt. Let's cross over live now to Jack Button. He's standing by in Brussels. Jack, what is the reaction by the European Union on the Egypt crisis?
Well, we've been getting the same reaction from the EU institutions as well as many of the 28 EU member states, and it has essentially been one of cautious engagement. Most of the messages have said that diplomacy will continue, aid will continue, as long as there are no human rights abuses, as long as the civilian population is protected. And as long as a roadmap back to democracy is set out, which includes a clear date for a future election. There are already concerns, though, of course, especially today with the reports of arrests of members of the Muslim Brotherhood. That is setting off alarm bells in Brussels. But the fundamental message is aid will continue, diplomacy will continue, as long as the interim government, and in particular the army, delivers on the promises that have been made.
But Jack, so you say aid will continue to flow there in Egypt, but let's look at the bigger picture. The political developments in Cairo, are they likely to impact Europe's relations with Egypt at all?
Well, only if that roadmap isn't really laid out. That's what all of this hinges on, or if the violence continues to escalate. Now, there is a lot at stake for Egypt. It's 5 billion euros in aid money that has been earmarked to help Egypt with the transition to full democracy. Officials here have made it very clear that if there isn't that roadmap spelled out, or if there is more violence, or if there are human rights abuses, that money isn't going to be forthcoming. The big worry in Europe right now, and it's even made the euro tumble a little bit today, is oil coming through the Suez Canal from the Middle East into Europe, and the potential threat that a breakdown in relations could pose. But I spoke to a senior policy expert today. He said the market, in his opinion, is overreacting, that even if those relations do sour further, that canal is likely to remain open simply because the military receives so much revenue out of it. Having said that, there is so much at stake that both the EU and Egypt are currently, really trying to make an effort here to work to keep that relationship going, which normally would tumble. A military coup just by itself would normally lead to automatic aid suspension, many other things, which is why EU officials have been going out of their way today to avoid the phrase military coup or the word coup, which of course is what's happened, which would automatically invoke so many diplomatic sanctions and aid suspension between the EU and Egypt.
All right, Jack, thanks very much for joining us. Jack Batten there live in Brussels. You're watching Africa Live. Let's take our first break this hour coming up.
Although Madiba sometimes may be uncomfortable, very few times he is in pain.
Mandela's wife seeks to reassure the country over his health. And deepening feud, Mandela's grandson accuses relatives of seeking to control Mandela's legacy.
We follow the latest trends in global politics, economics, culture and sport, and how Africa fits into the global picture. You decide what's important.
We need some trade and justice.
Africa's future will be determined by Africa.
For women's equal opportunity, for a better life.
We have to change something, and it's not the outsiders.
Talk Africa, a new voice for the world.
You're watching Africa Live. Welcome back. Nelson Mandela remains in a critical but stable condition. That's according to the South African presidency. Mandela's wife, Graça Machel, has also been speaking about the former president's health. She says Mandela has sometimes been uncomfortable but seldom in pain. She also thanked the thousands of well-wishers around the world for their support. Mandela was hospitalized on June the 8th with a lung infection.
These days, now we are about 25 days we have been in hospital. Although Madiba sometimes may be uncomfortable, very few times he is in pain, but he is fine. I think the best gift which he has given to this nation again is the gift of unity. At the beginning, he offered South Africa the gift of reconciliation, of bringing together all people, of all folks, of all races, of all ages, to rally around a dream of a South Africa which belongs to all, a South Africa which will provide better life for every single human being. Maybe in these years some of it we had forgotten. But while he lies in hospital, he offered an opportunity for all of us, again, from our hearts, from deep in our hearts, to be united. We saw young and old, rich and poor, black and white, people from all walks of life, all faith, you name it, but every single South African united.
So that's what Graça Machel says, but we're also hearing from the French news agency AFP, which on Thursday quoted doctors treating Nelson Mandela saying that he was in a permanent vegetative state and advised his family to turn off his life support machine. According to AFP, the doctors made the statement in court documents seen by the agency dated June 26. The documents are part of a legal filing related to a family dispute over reburying the remains of Mandela's 3 children. Now, staying with the Mandela family feud, and family members gathered for a special ceremony at the farm in Kunu in the Eastern Cape on Thursday when they brought home the remains of Nelson Mandela's 3 deceased children who were exhumed in Veso on Wednesday. The remains were buried on the farm at the site where Nelson Mandela will be buried one day when he dies. CCTV's Renee Delcam has more.
The remains of Nelson Mandela's 3 deceased children arrived at the Mandela family home around the same time that the South African presidency announced that the ailing statesman's condition remains unchanged, still critically ill after nearly a month in hospital. Family members held a short ceremony in honor of the Mandela children. They were the former statesman's baby daughter, Makaziwe, who died in 1948, his son, Tembekile, who was killed in a car accident in 1969, and another son, Makato, who died of an HIV/AIDS-related illness in 2006. Meanwhile, Mandla Mandela, who had earlier lost a court battle to keep the Mandela children buried in his village, held a media conference expressing his anger and disappointment.
In the past few days, I have been the subject of attacks from all sorts of individuals, wanting a few minutes of fame and media attention at my expense. In the first instance, I want to express the disappointment at the decision taken by the Mthatha High Court yesterday.
Mandla Mandela said his grandfather would be deeply disappointed if he knew about the divisions in the Mandela family. Mandla claims that many members of the Mandela family are out to taint his name. But some people here in Kunu and Mvezo say Mandla's actions are now threatening to distort the legacy of Nelson Mandela. Renee Delcam, CCTV, Kunu.
We'll take another quick break here on Africa Live, and when we return, apology demand. Uganda wants the UN to apologize for erroneously linking Kampala to Congo rebels. Zimbabwe's Constitutional Court has brought finality to the issue of when the next elections will be held. On June 13th, President Mugabe set July 31st as election day, a move that caused acrimony in the coalition government, with Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai calling the unilateral declaration unconstitutional. A subsequent SADC summit in Maputo, Mozambique, urged the government to appeal to the court for a 2-week extension to the date. Today, after a full day of hearings, the 9 Supreme Court judges dismissed the appeal and other applications seeking delay to the polls, saying that elections will proceed as proclaimed by President Mugabe.
You remember the last time it was 7-2, this time it was all 9 judges, reaffirming that basically the Constitution of Zimbabwe prevails. And we are going to elections on the 31st, and I hope we can move on from there.
After a full day of listening to applications seeking an extension to the July 31st election date that had been proclaimed by President Robert Mugabe, 9 Supreme Court justices sitting in the Constitutional Court ruled unanimously to dismiss those applications, therefore upholding the proclamation made by President Robert Mugabe. The application had been called for and recommended by a SADC summit that sat in Maputo, where it sought a 14-day extension to the July 31st date. But this highest court in the land now deciding that those applications did not hold water. This being the highest court in the land, Zimbabweans are now set to go to the polls on July 31st. Farai Mwakutuya, CCTV, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Uganda is demanding an apology from the United Nations after the country was absolved from allegedly supporting the M23 rebels. The new report, however, has not cleared Rwanda and instead accused the elements in the Kinshasa government of teaming with the Rwandan Hutu rebel group to fight the M23. CCTV's Isabel Naikiria with that report.
Just days after a leaked report by a UN panel of experts declaring Uganda was not to blame for providing military support to the Congolese M23 movement, the country is now demanding an apology. Uganda's Foreign Affairs Junior Minister Okello Oryem wants the UN to say sorry for the negative image it has caused.
We need a sincere apology from the UN, not only a verbal apology, but an apology in writing. And we need them in writing for them to apologize and to withdraw that statement and make it very clear that what the initial report was a mistake.
A group of experts at the UN Security Council said in a report last year that Uganda and Rwanda continue to support the M23 movement, both countries denying these allegations. Uganda reacted angrily, accusing the UN of betraying its efforts for peace in the region. Oryem says the new report does not come as a surprise.
It confirms that what I said, that it was rubbish, and I'm not surprised that we have been exonerated, because all along I've made it very clear and consistently that under no circumstances would we act so irresponsibly in assisting and aiding the M23.
The new report exonerating Uganda comes weeks after a visit by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to the country. Junior Minister Oryem dismissed claims that the two leaders discussed the new findings prior to their release. Uganda now says the allegations have tainted the country's image and its efforts to bring peace to the region. Since last year, Uganda has been mediating talks between the DRC government and M23 movement in Kampala. Uganda says the UN allegations have not in any way affected diplomatic relations with the DRC government, but calls on both the M23 and the Congo government to hastily conclude talks for peace to return to the region. Isabel Nakiria, CCTV, Kampala.